Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you who may be joining us from the West Coast, and welcome to today's webinar titled, What's New with RAD? My name is Tracy Newman, and I'm a Senior Program Manager with Quadell Consulting and Training in Washington, D.C., and I'll be moderating today's webcast, or a good portion of it. We are very pleased to have you join us today as we discuss the changes in HUD's RAD demonstration program, resulting from publication of HUD's RAD Revision 3 notice, which was published in January 12th of this year. Before we get started, I want to take a couple of minutes up front to discuss some basic webinar housekeeping issues. First off, we're scheduled to run approximately 90 minutes long today, but depending on how long it takes to get through the actual material and depending on the number of questions we have, we may run a little longer than originally anticipated. Just to note that this is actually a second session of last week's RAD webinar, which we are hosting again this week due to high demand and the fact that last week's session was sold out. We ran a little bit over our time slot for last week because there's so much content to cover in such a short period of time. So please keep that in mind today, as we may also run over our time slot for today. Second, due to the number of participants in today's webcast again, we will plan to address questions at the end of the webinar. Questions can be asked at any time throughout our session, but we will address and queue them up towards the end of the webinar. Also, we will be recording today's webcast, and we'll make the recording available to each of you in attendance today, either online, and it will be posted on each of our websites as well for you to download. Copies of materials for today's presentation have been uploaded and are available for you to download directly from the GoToWebinar control panel anytime during our session today. We've included a blackline version of the RAD Revision 3 notice published back in January of this year, which will allow you to see exactly what was changed or added to the notice. We've included the Federal Register notice authorizing an increase in the unit cap for RAD Component 1 transactions, and also uploaded a PDF version of today's presentation for you. Lastly, another quick reminder that you're all joining this webinar as participants, and therefore all lines have been placed on mute to help avoid or prevent any background noise, disruptions, or distractions. As I just mentioned a second ago, questions may be submitted in real time by clicking on the plus sign next to the questions dialog box in the GoToWebinar control panel, which is located at the right of your screen. And this will expand the questions dialog box and allow you to type your questions and click send. We'll do our best to monitor the questions and queue them up throughout the webinar so that we have them available and ready to address at the end of today's session. Questions at the end of today's webinar may also be asked verbally by clicking on the hand icon in the GoToWebinar control box, which will alert us that you wish to ask a question. And we'll do our best to monitor these requests and unmute your line, which will allow you to ask your question in real time at the end of the webinar. Now, with our housekeeping issues out of the way, we're pleased to introduce our very distinguished guest and affordable housing expert, Liz Bramlett, President of Liz Bramlett Consulting, who is joining us today as a panelist in our What's New with RAD webcast. Liz will focus on walking us through most of today's content and discussion about the new RAD Revision 3 notice. Originally, we planned to have Denise Muha, Executive Director for the National Lease Housing Association in Washington, D.C. We had planned to have her with us today as well, but unfortunately, due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, she's unable to attend and participate in today's session. We also have Nick Murphy, Training Manager for Quadell Consulting and Training, with us today, who will also assist in moderating our session. With our introductions now complete, but before I turn the presentations and controls over to Liz, we'll provide a brief update from Denise Muha on what's going on at Capitol Hill. Many of you may know that HUD's fiscal year ends September 30th for FY17, and Congress passed a CR, or what we call a continuing resolution, which essentially means that they punted and did not do their job or their due diligence to get the FY18 bills completed on time. Now, this CR extends HUD funding at FY17 levels until December 8th, at which time we expect Congress will pass a larger funding bill, or what we refer to as an omnibus, for FY18. The House passed their 12 bills a few weeks ago now, which will be the starting point for any discussions going forward in the larger funding or omnibus, which we hope to have by mid-December. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed on this. There's so much going on right now due to all of the hurricanes and the disaster relief and recovery work that's needed as a result of all the hurricanes. In relation to RAD, a few pending appropriations bill would do a few things. One, eliminate 225,000 unit cap altogether for public housing conversions under component 1. And by eliminating this cap, we tend to think that Congress is saying, we like RAD, we think that RAD really works, and we want to support it. And the bill would maintain or slightly increase the public housing operating or capital funds, and funding for vouchers and PBRA would be slightly over the FY17 levels. Now, a few new items included in this bill that we expect to pass are a provision which will allow 202 PRACs to convert under RAD Component 2, what we refer to as RAD for PRACs. And the RAD for PRACs expansion is in both the House and Senate FY18 HUD Appropriations Bill. So we're pleased that both the House passed HUD Appropriations Bill and the Senate Appropriations Committee passed HUD Appropriations Bill include this needed expansion of RAD for 202 PRAC properties, which is very important because these properties really don't have any other way or any other option for refinancing or recapitalizing for needed upgrades or repairs to their facilities. In addition to providing RAD for PRAC, the Senate bill will also provide upwards of $4 million to allow the successful conversion of some PRAC communities to the Section 8 subsidy platform. Lastly, another new item in the bill would allow up to market rate rents for certain RAD 2 conversions for mod rehab, RAP, or rent sup properties, which are located in tight markets such as Boston or New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, and which entice owners to convert assistance contracts and help ensure there's an adequate supply of ongoing affordable housing units in these tight or high housing market areas where rents limited at 110% or 120% of FMRs for RAD conversion aren't really enough to make these deals work. So there's a couple of pending legislative issues and some updates we wanted to bring to your attention. And with those few updates out of the way, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to Liz Bramlett. So welcome, Liz.
Hello.
And with that, take it away. I'll make you our presenter.
Okay. Show my screen. Alrighty. Show here.
Okay, we have your screen.
Okay, so you've got my screen. Now, I'm not seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing here, am I?
Your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, and okay, there we are.
Perfect.
All right, and this. All right. Thank you for your patience, everybody, and welcome to our training this week on what's new with RAD. We have a good crowd today, just like we did last week, and we're very happy about that because we want to get this information out to as many people as we possibly can. We do expect the material to take at least the entire scheduled time, as Tracy noted before. Please do submit your questions in real time the way Tracy instructed you to. We're going to try to leave some time for verbal questions at the end of the training. And keep in mind, if you don't get all your questions asked and answered during the training, Tracy and I will be happy to help you with any questions you have after the training, because we want everybody to go away from this class today with the best information and the most information that they possibly can. So having said that, let's get started. In part one, let us talk about the notice HUD recently issued upping the public housing unit cap. In August, HUD issued a notice in the Federal Register regarding the RAD program, and they increased the unit cap from 185,000 to 225,000 for public housing units that are now able to convert to long-term Section 8. And HUD, when they're implementing this new cap, this higher cap, HUD must select their properties through the competitive process using the existing waiting list and the established selection criteria that we will be talking about part today through our webinar. Now, if you want to know where you are on the waiting list, they have issued it as of August 14th, and you can download the waiting list and look for your project by clicking on this link, which you have available in the PDF of the slideshow that has been uploaded for you. Now, HUD can make RAD awards to projects where PHAs have only submitted letters of interest to reserve their place on the waiting list, as long as they have submitted a complete RAD application within 60 days of August 23rd, 2017. So we're talking about by mid-October, the complete application needs to be submitted in order to be one of the first 40,000 who are able to receive a CHAP award. Now, for the CHAPs that are issued beyond the previous cap of 185,000 units, and for any replacement awards made as a result of revocations or withdrawals that occurred after May 5th, 2017, HUD will set the initial Section 8 rents using the fiscal year 2016 funding levels for as they were public housing units. And you don't have to calculate your initial rents. They are, HUD calculates them for you. And again, there's the link here, which you can download the rents, what your initial Section 8 rents will be. And you have this link in the PDF of this slideshow, which you can download. Now, HUD has begun to issue CHAPs for the next 40,000 units on the waiting list, where they have already received the completed application, and they have been getting in contact with individual PHAs that had submitted their letters of interest to make sure that they know that they're in the top 40,000, but they need to get a complete application in on time if they want to be part of this next group that will receive a CHAP award. Now, after the 40,000 units are awarded their CHAPs, then there's still going to be a waiting list of over 48,000. And PHAs who have not yet applied but are interested in RAD may submit letters of interest in lieu of a RAD application to reserve their position on the waiting list. And later on in the webinar, we're going to talk about the implications of submitting a full application versus just submitting a letter of interest, because there are some other points you want to know about that. HUD has published a sample, what they call RIN, a Resident Information Notice, which PHAs can use to provide basic information to residents about the proposed conversion. You would send it out at the same time you send out the GIN, the General Information Notice that we're familiar with under the Uniform Relocation Act. And PHAs are required to provide a RIN to all residents of a converting project prior to the first of the 2 meetings that you must have with your residents before submitting a RAD application. HUD has also published a revised resident fact sheet, which again you can download using this link, which were designed to inform residents about the important aspects of the RAD conversion process that are most important to them. And HUD recommends that PHAs provide these resident fact sheets to all of their residents in covered projects, no matter where you are in the RAD conversion process. All righty. Let's move on to part 2 and talk about where we're talking about the bulk of today's training, the third version, the third revision of the RAD notice. HUD issued it on January 12, 2017, so that was earlier this year. It's PIH Notice 2012-32, Revision 3. And this notice will be the RAD notice, as it's referred to, until it is amended, superseded, or rescinded. And HUD says that the changes from previous notices to this notice, the reason they put these changes into this notice and the reason for the issuance of another revision is they want to incorporate all the lessons they've learned from implementing RAD to date. And they've had some ideas for some streamlining and some simplification and some flexibility that they want to add to the program to help hopefully make more conversions work. There are 3 sections to the notice, and we're going to focus on section 1 of the notice, which covers conversions of public housing units converting to long-term Section 8. And all of the changes in the notice are effective by now. Some of the changes to eligibility and section criteria weren't effective until February 21st. So that means by this late in September, certainly all of the changes announced in this version of the RAD notice are in effect. Now, some of you might be asking, in earlier versions and earlier training that I participated in, I believe we talked about mod rehab when we were talking about component 1. And it used to be an owner of a mod rehab project could elect to convert under either component 1 or RAD component 2. But that has changed. Now all RAD conversions for mod rehab projects are only allowed under RAD's second component. And if anybody is interested in information on how to do a conversion for a mod rehab project, you look to section 2 of this revised notice. Let's talk about some general program issues. By the way, as I am going through the training today, because there's so much to talk about, we're focusing on just what's changed in revision 3 from revision 2. And so we can't get to every single detail of the RAD program. That would be several days of training all by itself. But we do want to stress what's changed from revision 2. And again, we're only focusing on public housing. So if you need information on how to do a mod rehab, we said go to section 2 of the notice. If you need to learn how to do a conversion for a RAP or RIP sub project, those are addressed in in section 3 of the notice. As we go through the information in section 1 of the notice, we discussed, Tracy and Diane and I, we discussed what would be the best order to present the information, how it would be most helpful to you. And we decided that we would just go in the order of the notice so you could know where to find the information. If you want to look to even more detail than we're providing to see what is everything that's in the RAD notice, you will know where to look for it because we are just going all through section 1 in the same order as the notice is written. And also remember, if you're looking for a particular topic in the RAD notice in section 1, they have a pretty detailed table of contents at the beginning of the notice that is very helpful in you being able to find the information that you're looking for. In section 1.2e, HUD addresses what they consider to be a very important topic, so the civil rights requirements that are associated with the RAD program. And HUD provides a list of activities where owners have to receive HUD's written approval before implementing them as part of a RAD conversion. HUD must approve, for example, a conversion where the project will serve a different population. So if the project will change from housing families to housing the elderly or the disabled, HUD has to approve that change for that project. And you need to explain why it makes sense for you to change the market that you're serving through your project and how you know that this change really makes sense for your market. The RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation Checklist requires submission of information regarding conversions of assistance and where the relocation will last at least 12 months. 12 months is a red line that you cross whenever you're doing relocation. When a temporary relocated person crosses over and has been relocated for more than 12 months, certain rights kick in for them, and they have the right to be asked, do they want to be considered permanent relocated and then have the full benefits of the Uniform Relocation Act. So it's important for you to track when residents are getting close to that 12-month point. Also, they require information regarding conversions of assistance involving new construction or sub-rehab, as those terms are defined in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So they are reminding owners that they are definitely covered by Section 504, and they want information on any time you're doing relocation that involves either new construction or sub-rehab. With regards to eligibility, Hope 6 projects. There's always been some gray areas with regards to Hope 6 projects, whether they are or are not considered eligible to be part of a RAD conversion. It all goes back to their date of funding availability, the DOFA that approved them to be a part of the Hope 6 program. It's under their DOFA that they applied for funding, and then they received funding under that DOFA. And projects with a date of funding availability, a DOFA, of greater than 10 years prior to submitting their RAD application, they are eligible for a RAD conversion. They make it clear in this notice that where a Hope 6 project was developed in phases on a contiguous site, each of the phases may have its own distinct DOFA dates. They may have each, say there's 3 phases, they may have been funded under 3 different DOFAs. But for purposes of the RAD application, it's the date on the earliest DOFA that applies when we're trying to figure out whether they can be part of the RAD program. So long as the DOFA for the first phase is more than 10 years old prior to submitting the RAD application, the entire site can be part of the conversion through the RAD program. Also, owners of Hope 6 projects, that would be the final public housing units in their portfolio, may also apply for a RAD conversion. So if you've got one Hope 6 project left, and it's also your only public housing unit, you're getting out of the public housing program, so to speak, then you can say that's the reason you are eligible and submit your application for a RAD conversion. On Monday, HUD issued a RAD blast, and they always, that's the way they're spelled, like you are here on the screen. There's always that exclamation point at the end. And they addressed several issues in that RAD blast, and we're going to be talking about, we've incorporated that information into this training. And one of the issues they addressed in their most recent blast is regarding the CNA tool that they have been developing over time that is going to be required for RAD conversions. They've changed the date for a variety of reasons. Now an owner is required to use their new CNA tool as part of any financing plan submitted after February 1st, 2018. So that's different than what it says in the notice that we're covering today. So this is more current, and you want to make sure everybody who's involved and needs to know understands that the due deadline is February 1st. In the meantime, PHAs may continue to use the existing RPCA tool, and Office of ReCap is producing some PHA-specific trainings and a revised user guide. So through RadGlass, they will be announcing that they are probably doing webinars, and then they usually put recordings of their webinars and their slides for the webinar out there. They usually post them where they post all that stuff through the RAD homepage. And that way, even if you can't attend the webinar, you have available the information from it, and will help you learn about how to use the CNA e-tool. They also say in the RAD Blast that providers of CNAs are going through training on how to complete their work using the CNA e-tool. And so you want to, if you're looking to procure a CNA, you want to look, one of the questions you want to ask your vendors is, have you received training on this? Because you want to make sure that they are ready and able to do the work you need done. Now, there are some CNA e-tool exemptions. HUD may exempt the following transaction types from CNA requirements, with the exception of preparing the 20-year reserve schedule and the utility consumption baseline. Okay, you can be exempt from submitting a CNA if your project will be financed with tax credits. And I believe that's because they know most of the state agencies require a CNA for all of their tax credit applications. You can receive an exemption if you have a project where the total assisted units, RAD units plus other PBV units at the project will constitute less than 20% of the total units at the project, or a higher amount at HUD's discretion. No utility consumption baseline analysis is necessary for buildings being demolished or being removed from the assisted inventory. Utility consumption baseline requirements for new construction will apply in accordance with how they already work in the PBRA or PBV programs. And any proposed exemptions, if you believe that you are exempt from the CNA e-tool requirement or the baseline analysis for utility consumption, you need to talk that over with your transaction manager that HUD has assigned you. And this is a good point to say you want to be comfortable and knowledgeable and have a constructive relationship with your transaction manager, because they govern so much of what happens through your RAD conversion, and you want a good working relationship with them to keep things running smoothly. And when it comes to green building and energy efficient issues, HUD addresses the green building standards that must be met for both new construction and rehab. And they are different standards in new construction versus rehabs. And that's in section 1.4.82. HUD provides a lot of detail and a lot of expanded guidance and detail about the standards projects must meet. And they reference several very detailed building codes in this guidance. So anyone who's involved in developing a construction plan for RAD conversion, who's really in the construction, in the meat of the construction part of this, they need to become familiar with these standards, because when they are planning the construction and costing it out, they need to know what standards need to be met. All RAD applications must include a completed environmental review under either Part 50 or Part 58. And whether you need a Part 50 or Part 58 review is based on how you are financing your project. HUD will not approve any financing plan or an RCC for any owner that has not submitted an environmental review that meets the requirements that they spell out in attachment 1A of this revised notice. So if you're worried about your environmental reviews, if you're responsible for getting your environmental reviews, go to attachment 1A to see the standards that you need to make sure that you meet. Substantial conversion of assistance, and other very good topic. In section 1.4.A4, HUD states that a PHA may not reduce the number of ACC units at a project without Section 18 demo or dispo approval from the Special Application Center, the SAC. A PHA must submit within their PIC removal application a narrative that explains the proposed reduction, including a description of the units to be removed. You have to say why you're reducing the number of units and explain, are these 1, 2, 6-bedroom units? Do they are any of these accessible units? What do we need to know about the type of units that are going to be removed? The PHA must explain why the project meets the criteria to be excluded, importantly, from the requirement that they not reduce the number of units through a RAD conversion other than what they call by a de minimis amount. The transaction manager, again, will approve any reduction of units by project or portfolio. So you need to be able to explain to your transaction manager why they should approve this reduction in the number of units, because that's a very sensitive area. And any property or proceeds received from the sale of any property under the de minimis exception must be used for affordable housing purposes. And in this version of the RAD notice, if you go to the definitions area, they've expanded the definition of affordable housing purposes. And you can read from that what you can do with any funds, any excess funds that your PHA receives from doing a RAD conversion. Any excess funds have to be deposited in a HUD-approved account and only used for affordable housing purposes. When it comes to relocation requirements, in section 1.4A5, HUD addresses fair housing, civil rights, and resident relocation issues. And don't forget that we have a notice that specifically addresses relocation issues. The most current version of that notice is PIH 2016-17 that Quadell uploaded to the information that you are able to download as part of this webinar. The attachments to that notice provide guidance on what should be included in a relocation plan and also includes recommended resident notices. And always remember that when we're talking about relocation issues, if the general RAD notice conflicts with guidance given in the relocation notice rules. So if you have a question, you want to go to that relocation notice and see what it says about the particular issue you are dealing with. Now, the relocation notice states that all residents being temporarily relocated must be allowed to return to the covered project, but it does not need to say it must be the same unit or one of the same size. And this is an area where you really want to be careful with the residents. You do not want to guarantee them a return to the same unit if that probably is not going to happen. All kinds of things can happen when you do rehab of a project. And there's all kinds of reasons why a tenant has the right, undisputed right, to return to the project, but they might not get back into the same unit. Keep in mind, HUD encourages owners to right-size their units as part of your relocation plan. So as you are developing your relocation plan, you want to make sure that you look at your tenant population, see how many people are overhoused, how many people are underhoused, and see how you can address all of those issues as you plan your relocation activity. Now, in the new RAD blast, HUD has, they tell us, this is important for us all to know, HUD has contracted with a firm to conduct preliminary compliance reviews of completed RAD conversions, and because they want to see how they worked out, and they want to see how they can better carry out oversight of relocation and construction activity. So these firms are going to be looking at your relocation activity and your construction activity. They selected 90 properties, and they were selected, we are told, at random for either a relocation review or a construction review. And these reviews are going to be conducted as desk audits. So that means usually they're not coming out to the project. That means that they will ask for you to submit files to them to answer any questions they have or any information they want to look at regarding how your relocation plan it was actually implemented and any information on your construction. So you want to make sure you're keeping your files in order in case you are ever chosen to be a project to go through one of these reviews. Now, remember, in a RAD project, there is no such thing as an involuntary permanent relocation because all tenants have the right to return. Anybody who's involved in planning relocation needs to read the relocation notice to understand how they must deal with residents who will be relocated for more than 1 year or who the owner would like to, if possible, permanent relocate. Residents going through a RAD conversion are not eligible for tenant protection vouchers. That's important to know. That when you're dealing with residents who maybe they would prefer to be relocated permanently for a variety of reasons, they are not eligible for what sometimes are called sticky vouchers. They are vouchers that are issued because of some sort of owner activities, but a RAD conversion does not trigger tenant protection vouchers, probably under the theory that the project is converting to long-term Section 8. So there would be no need for tenant protection vouchers. So you want to make sure you don't start telling your tenants, well, if you relocate permanently, we have vouchers to give you, because that is not at all the case under RAD unless you find some other way. If PHA has some other way that they were able to give one of these tenants a voucher. Accessibility requirements, also an important topic and a touchy topic in our RAD conversions. They remind owners that most covered projects, most projects that are converting from public housing to long-term Section 8 are governed by more than one law that governs accessibility issues. You are covered by the Civil Rights Act, the ADA, Section 504, the Fair Housing Act. There's multiple, and there might be state and local laws that also add to your requirements with regard to providing accessible housing in your projects. HUD reminds owners that you can't just pick the most, what seems like the most stringent law and follow it. You have to make sure that you comply with each specific requirement required under each of those laws. So that again takes careful planning. You want to make sure who's ever involved with construction understands you have to meet all of those requirements, and that's put in the construction checklist, that all of those requirements are met. When it comes to site selection and neighborhood standards, the PHA must certify with the submission of its annual plan and the significant amendment to its annual plan, to the 5-year plan, or the moving to work plan, that it complies with the applicable site selection requirements. HUD will conduct a front-end civil rights review of the PHA's proposed site in some cases. They want to make sure you meet the standards that they look for when it comes to like site selection. For example, they don't want people moving a project to an area that already has a high concentration of public and assisted housing or already has a high concentration of poverty. They definitely want to avoid that. So you want to make sure that you're ready to address any questions about where you are moving your site. If you don't want the assistant to say at the same site it's already been at, and you want to be ready for one of these reviews. And remember, they're front-end reviews that PHAs are being subjected to. When it comes to demolition, unless approved in writing by HUD, a PHA may not demolish or dispose of units until after the closing of construction financing for the covered project. They don't want any buildings torn down until they know for sure you have the financing in place to tear it down and to build new units to house the residents that have been relocated for the construction. Both the demolition and the new construction or rehab are considered as part of a single environmental review. Section 18, demo and dispo, does not apply to RAD conversions and is not required when conversions include demolition. Demolition approved pursuant to Section 18 is not sufficient to permit demolition of units under RAD and may cause the converting project to be ineligible. So just because you got approved to demolish a project under Section 18 does not mean it's automatically eligible to be demolished under a RAD conversion. Now, what about some ownership issues? Except we're permitted to facilitate the use of low-income housing tax credits during both the initial term and all renewal terms of the HAP contract, HUD will require ownership or control of the covered project by a public or nonprofit entity. So an owner wants to make sure that they have the right guidance when it comes to how they structure the new ownership. And that usually involves, in my experience, an attorney, a good attorney who understands this business and want to make sure that they've read all the information about RAD so they can help you form your new ownership structure that meets all the requirements for all the programs that might be involved with your converted project, I should say. Now, when it comes to transfer of assistance, HUD will assess that the transfer does not place housing, like we said earlier, in neighborhoods with highly concentrated poverty based on the criteria formulated for transfers. And you can find that criteria at the RAD homepage. At a minimum, projects that are located in neighborhoods that meet these criteria will meet the requirement under this notice that transfers not occur to neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Unless otherwise approved by HUD, a PHA may transfer units from a public housing project to an existing tax credit project within its 15-year compliance period only if the transfer is necessary to help with the deconcentration of poverty or de-densification of public housing units. So you need to be able to show that you meet that criteria in order to transfer assistance to a tax credit project that is still within its 15-year compliance period. And HUD provides very detailed guidance for owners transferring assistance at conversion and for those who will apply for transfer at a later date. Very detailed in the notice. And so if you are transferring assistance, you want to make sure you get a hold of this information and understand the information provided. Also in the new RAD Blast, for RAD conversions involving a transfer of assistance, there are two options to when residents will remain in their original public housing units until construction is completed. You can either do a conventional conversion with a master lease or do what they call a delayed conversion. And at the RAD resource desk, which you can click on here, they have issued some information to help owners understand the implications of selecting one of these two options. It's called Overview of Master Leases and Delayed Conversion Agreements. And so you want to get a hold of that. You can get it at the RAD resource desk, and it will help you if this situation applies to your conversion that you're planning. You want to get a hold of this information, and it will help you make a good decision for selecting one of these two options. Owners planning to transfer assistance, again, must read this section of this notice, the notice we're talking about today, to ensure that you comply. And again, we have such limited time today, we can't go into all of the detail, but for anything we don't get to finish all the detail on today, if you'd like help, you want to talk about it after the webinar or some other day, you are welcome to reach out to Tracy or me, and we will be happy to help you. Section 3. It applies to all work, including any new construction that is identified in the financing plan and RAD conversion commitment. It may apply to the project after conversion based on the federal financial assistance supporting the project. With regards to lead-based paint, They are not announcing any new requirements here. What HUD did in the most recent notice, the third revision that we're talking about, they are reminding owners of their existing lead-based paint related requirements and reminding you they are definitely included in a RAD conversion. A PHA is required to convert a lead-based paint inspection, conduct a lead-based paint inspection and a lead risk assessment on a pre-1978 public housing property and conduct ongoing lead-based paint maintenance and periodic reevaluation for lead-based paint hazards. The PHA must provide any documentation available regarding lead-based paints and lead-based paint hazards to the firm preparing your CNA and to anybody involved in the ownership. The owner must evaluate and control lead-based paint hazards. They're included in 24 CFR Part 35, Subpart H, including completing a risk assessment if the property will receive more than $5,000 per unit in rental assistance subsidy. And the CNA must incorporate the work necessary to meet the owner's requirements to treat those lead-based paint hazards. Alrighty, project conversion requirements and financing considerations. HUD encourages PHAs who are experienced with the current financing trends you find in the private market to hire a knowledgeable consultant to help them determine the best way to finance their project. And I think this is good advice. There are a lot of folks out there who are experts at using the tools within the public housing program, the various funding sources attached to public housing, to develop and manage and operate their projects. If you are venturing into a new world where you're maybe using low-income housing tax credits or home or the Housing Trust Fund program, at least for your first conversion, it will be very helpful to use a consultant who can help walk you through the process and make you an expert yourself in these new funding trends, and you can use that information you develop going forward. With regards to using any debt financing for your covered project, all loans that are secured by that covered project, they have to be recorded in the public record, but they have to be recorded not in first position. They have to be recorded after the RAD use agreement. Also, any debt must carry a fixed interest rate and amortize over a 40-year, no longer than a 40-year period. Not have a balloon payment until after the earlier of the expiration of the HAP contract or 17 years from the date of the permanent financing, and not have a debt service coverage of less than 1.11 or lender requirements. What they're talking about here is your net operating income that the project generates. That's what's available then to pay your debt service. And they want your net operating income to be at least 11% greater than the debt service you'll have to meet. And so they're wanting to make sure there's a cushion in your NOI in order, if expenses go up, that you'll still have enough money to make your debt payments. And believe me, if you are going to be using other funding sources like low-income housing tax credits or the home program, those providers, your state agencies involved in those programs, or city agencies in some cases, they will, as they underwrite your projects, they will definitely have a debt service requirement they will want you to meet, and it's usually greater than 1.11. Now, those conditions are applicable only to your first mortgage, not any soft debt that you take on. In all subordinate or secondary financing, your soft debt must be disclosed and approved by the first mortgage lender as well as by HUD. And there are a wide variety of programs through which you can obtain soft debt for your project. We have the new Housing Trust Fund, CDBG, Home, the Affordable Housing Program through the Federal Home Loan Bank program. Now, when it comes to your public housing funds, With HUD approval, you may also use Section 18 dispo proceeds if it complies, if the way you are demolishing units at your project complies with Section 18. Moving to work agencies may use their block grant as additional source of capital to support conversion as either debt or as equity. And financing proceeds in excess of the transaction costs will not be allowed when a public housing when you're using public housing capital or operating funds, or you're using moving to work block grant funds. And if any of those are contributed to the project, you cannot receive excessive transaction costs. When a PHA is converting all of its ACC units, again, you're getting out of the public housing business, then there's no restriction on the amount of public housing funds that may be contributed to your projects that you are converting. And the PHA may convey all program funds then to the covered projects. Now, when it comes to any existing debts and obligations, a PHA, as part of the financing plan, must disclose the amount of project debt associated with the project prior to the conversion, including energy performance contracts, capital fund financing, operating fund financing, etc. RAD does not prohibit excess equity proceeds from being used to support affordable housing programs. Affordable housing purposes. So when you are financing your conversion using low-income housing tax credits, you might get more equity invested by your investor partners than necessary for the project. That excess amount can be deposited into that HUD-approved account and then used for future affordable housing activities. They want to remind PHAs and anybody who's new to the tax credit program that most states face excessive demand on an annual basis for owners who want to receive an allocation of the 9% competitive credits, and also routinely do not fully allocate their supply of 4% as of right credits, coupled with tax-exempt bond financing under their annual private activity bond volume cap. So if they issue bonds under what's called their volume cap, then they can provide tax-exempt interest, a tax-exempt interest loan to the converting project. And if the project is structured to receive to also qualify for the tax credit program, the owner can also receive 4% credits along with the bond financing. And you'll hear these deals referred to as 4% bond deals. They're letting you know that you might not be able to compete for the 9% credits, but you have this other option where you can receive the private activity bond financing and the 4% credits. Keep in mind, however, that states that receive private activity bonds under the volume cap, affordable housing competes for other uses. So a state might decide that they don't want to use any of their private activity bond, any of their volume cap to fund housing. They might instead be into economic development activities or industrial development activities, or they may only use a third of their volume cap to finance affordable housing, and they use the rest of their volume cap for the year to finance industrial development. So you want to make sure you know within your state, within your jurisdiction, how do I go about applying for my 9% credits? What are my chances of receiving 9% credits? And also, how do I go about applying for bond financing under the volume cap? Are they doing that here? And how do I go about applying for it if they are providing that financing for affordable housing? Now, HUD reminds owners that, again, there are numerous other places to get soft debt through both state and federal programs, CDBG Home, the Housing Trust Fund, the Affordable Housing Program, and also make sure you investigate what additional programs your state and cities have to offer, because many localities and many states have developed their own trust fund program before the federal government did. And they have other techniques and other methods that they use in their jurisdiction to finance affordable housing. So you want to find out how to utilize that local funding as well. Acquisition proceeds. For transactions involving the transfer of ownership to a new entity, a PHA is permitted to receive cash acquisition proceeds in excess of any seller take-back financing. Again, the proceeds must be used for affordable housing purposes and must be escrowed at closing or during any construction period associated with the RAD conversion. Use of public housing funds. PHAs are permitted to use available public housing funding, including operating reserves, capital funds, replacement housing factor funds, demolition and decimal funds, traditional funding in their development budget to support their conversion for rehab or new construction and to increase their initial contract rents. HUD provides a lot of new and very detailed guidance on how you may utilize your PA public housing funds. So if you're involved in figuring out the financing for your project and what your options are, you want to read this section of the notice. It's 1.5A. You want to read this section of the notice so you can claim a good understanding of how you can fit your public housing funds into your overall development budget. Section 18 applies, we're talking demo and dispo, applies only in these situations. The disposition of excess land. If a PHA proposed to reduce the number of assisted units by more than a de minimis amount. Where assistance is transferred from a converting project and HUD has not approved the future use of the converting project site or sales proceeds as part of the RAD conversion. Otherwise, the PHA cannot have both a CHAP and an approval for Section 8 application for the same public housing units. A PHA may submit applications for both a RAD conversion and a Section 8 action for the same units, and you might actually receive approval for both. But you have 90 days after receiving that second approval to decide, do you want to do a Section 8 demo and dispo, or do you want to be part of a RAD conversion? In Section 15E, HUD addresses amending your annual plan and your 5-year plan. And a RAD conversion does constitute a significant amendment to both the annual and the 5-year plan, and they provide detailed guidance on what the plan requirements are, what needs to go in your plan with regards to the RAD conversion, and the consequences of not complying with this for your RAD conversion. This seems like just an administrative detail that needs to be dealt with, but not completing updating your 5-year plan and your annual plan can delay your RCC, can delay the closing. So you want to make sure you take care of this properly. If a moving to work agency chooses to convert assistance to PBRA and not to PBV, the covered projects will no longer be included as part of their moving to work program. FAS. Here we're talking about how we remove projects from FAS scoring, because you don't want a project who's going through conversion to still hit you, to have the ability to nick you under a FAS inspection. So for a project with a CHAP to be excluded from FAS indicator scores, immediately after the issuance of the CHAP, the PHA must submit an application in the PIC inventory removals module as either RAD conversion PBV or RAD conversion PBRA for all units covered by the CHAP. And the PHA must submit the application in PIC, importantly, by the end of the fiscal year for the project, and so it's not included in the next year's FAS scoring. They address lease conversions. Public housing lease terminations, part of a RAD conversion, do not qualify as an adverse action, provided that the tenants are provided with a notice of termination in accordance with HUD regs and information on how and when they will receive their new Section 8 lease, which must be effective the same date as the HAP contract becomes effective. There are no grievance procedures here because there's nothing being done to cause a grievance. They have the right to stay in their units, relocate back to it. They're just converting from public housing to Section 8. All righty, let's talk about some special issues regarding PBV conversions. We're converting from public housing to PBV. They have waived a limited number of regular PBV requirements in order to help make RAD conversions possible. But keep in mind always that anything that has not specifically been revoked remains a requirement for the PBV program, even for RAD converted projects. Covered projects do not count against the percentage limitation applicable to the PBV program. So the PHA who is administering the PBV contract, whatever number is covered by that project, that number is not counted as part of the limited number of PBV units they can have in their overall program. There is no cap on the number of units that may receive PBV assistance in each project, which is important. Covered projects shall have an initial HAP contract term of at least 15 years or up to 20 years upon request of the project owner and with approval by the administrative voucher agency. Any HUD approval of a PHA's request post-conversion to reduce the number of assisted units is subject to conditions that HUD may impose and is reviewed by HUD in the regular course of administration of the PBV program. And moving to work agencies may not alter this particular requirement. HUD approval, okay, already talked about that. Let's go on. Use agreements for RAD conversions must say that if the HAP is removed due to breach, non-compliance, or insufficiency of appropriations for all units previously covered under the HAP, new tenants must have incomes at or below 80% of the AMI, and rents may not exceed 30% of 80% of the AMI for an appropriate unit size, for an appropriately sized unit for the remainder of the term of the RAD use agreement. And it needs to require compliance with all fair housing and civil rights requirements, including marketing under an affirmative fair housing marketing plan. You want to learn how HUD establishes your initial contract rents based on when you receive your conversion. In the first section of the webinar, we discussed initial contract rents for projects being awarded conversions under the increase of $40,000 to the PHA unit cap. Those rents will all be set based on 2016 funding levels, and we gave you a link where you can download the rents for your project so you can see where your initial contract rents will be set. Any use of moving to work block grant funds in setting initial contract rents shall be subject to subsidy layering reviews and moving to work continued service requirements as calculated using the moving to work baseline methodology. There is no limit to the number of projects that a PHA may bundle if you want to bundle projects to set your initial rents. But keep in mind that the donor project, the project that is lowering their rents so that another project, the recipient one, can raise their rents, that donor project cannot convert later than the recipient one. Initial contract rents, when you're bundling projects, so you're changing what some of your rents are, you're sharing the proceeds, so to speak. The initial contract rents cannot exceed the lower of the reasonable rent, the payment standard, or the rent requested by the owner. So you know that you will have a rent floor. Rents will be adjusted annually through the application of the OCAF, the operating cost adjustment factor that's announced for your area. The rent to owner may not exceed the reasonable rent, but here's another rent floor for you, but will never be lower than the initial rent. So even if your rents go down, you know, they can't be forced lower than the initial rent they set for your projects. And moving to work agencies cannot alter this particular requirement. When work is occurring under RAD, HUD requires that all units meet HQS no later than the date of completion of the work as indicated in the RCC. So you don't have to meet HQS requirements during construction. They will make sure that you meet HQS requirements when the work is completed. You may have floating units. If you are a partially assisted project, you may have units that float. And the HAP contract must specify the number and type of units in the property that are designated as RAD units, including any accepted units. From the time of initial execution of the PBV, RAD HAP contract, the property must maintain the same number and type of units, including the same number and type of Section 504 accessible units. When work is occurring under RAD, oh, that's a double, excuse me for that. In Section 1.6c, HUD begins a long discussion of residents' rights. Current households cannot be excluded from the occupancy at the converted project based on any rescreening, income eligibility, or income targeting. Project owners must renew all leases upon lease expiration, and that includes moving to work agencies. A PHA must create a policy that you follow that sets a standard policy, setting the length of the phase-in period for rent increases at 3 years or 5 years or a combination thereof, depending on circumstances. In either the 3-year phase-in or the 5-year phase-in, once the calculated PBV TTP is equal to or less than the previous TTP, the phase-in ends and the tenant will pay their TTP as fully calculated going forward. Moving to work agencies must also implement a 3 or 5 year phase-in for impacted residents, but may alter the terms above as long as it establishes, again, a written policy that they set and consistently implement going forward. Public housing residents that are currently FSS participants will continue to be eligible for FSS. The PHA may continue to use any FSS funds already awarded to serve those particular participants who live in the units converted by RAD. At the completion of the FSS grant, PHAs need to follow their normal closeout procedures outlined in your grant agreement. The notice reminds owners that, and this is a good reminder, that FSS requirements differ under public housing than they do under the HCV program. At the completion of the Ross SC grant, PHA should follow the normal closeout procedures. Again, they're outlined in your grant agreement. You want to remember that Ross SC grantees may be a nonprofit or local resident association, and whatever you're doing will have a consequence for them as well. Residents may form a resident organization and receive funding, and that is discussed in attachment 1B of the RAD notice. So you want to take a look at that if this applies to your project. And it really could apply to all projects, because in all RAD converting projects, the residents do have the right to form a resident association. PHAs must provide adequate written notice of termination of the lease, which shall be no longer than 30 days if the health and safety of residents are not threatened, 14 days for non-payment of rent, 30 days for other causes. Now, if they receive the earned income disregard at conversion, they will continue to receive it for the established time period after conversion. And this applies only to residents receiving the earned income disregard at conversion, and not to any new tenants. And remember that they don't have to be disabled, because in the HCV disregard, they need to be disabled to receive it. In the public housing program, they don't, and that will continue on for those particular tenants. Jobs Plus grantees that convert the Jobs Plus target projects under RAD will be able to finish their jobs plus period of performance unless significant relocation and or change in building occupancy is planned. Now, when you calculate a tenant's TTP and exceeds the gross rent for the unit, what do we do? The rent to the owner for the unit will equal the lesser of the family's TTP less the utility allowance or the maximum tax credit rent. Because if you're not receiving an assistance payment for a tax credit tenant, you cannot collect more than the tax credit rent. When the family's TTP falls below the gross rent, then normal PBB rules apply about how much rent you charge and what it means if it's also a tax credit unit. If units are removed from the HAP because a new resident's TTP comes to equal or exceed the gross rent, and if the project is fully assisted, HUD requires that the PHA reinstate the unit after the family vacates. If the project is partially assisted, the PHA may substitute a different unit for the one with the tenant who's paying more than the gross rent on the HAP contract. Now, if a family is in an under-occupied unit at the time of conversion, they may remain in the unit until an appropriate size unit becomes available at the same project and then must move to the right size unit when it is available. HUD addresses how residents of the converting project can be placed on other PHA's waiting list. They have recommendations for how a PHA may place residents on other waiting lists, including other site-based waiting lists. Applicants must be placed on other waiting lists based on the date and time of their original applications. And you want to look closely at this part of the notice if this is something that you are dealing with, and many of you will be. Owners must receive HUD approval for any refinancing or restructuring of the secured debt during the HAP contract term. And with respect to any financing contemplated at the time of conversion, including any permanent financing, which is a conversion, or takeout of construction financing, such consent must be evidenced, must be included through the RAD conversion commitment. HUD is establishing an alternative requirement for PHAs, where as a result of RAD, the total number of PBB units, including RAD PBB, under the HAP contract exceeds 20% of their authorized units. The alternative mobility policy provides that a PHA would not be required to provide more than 3/4 of its turnover vouchers in any year to residents of RAD projects. And that's important to definitely to keep in mind if you're having a difficult time providing vouchers to move because you have so many people moving from PBV units. All right, let's talk about special provisions when we're talking about converting from public housing to PBRA. HUD has waived, again, a limited number of provisions we're used to in the PBRA world, but they waived them to make more RAD conversions applicable, or enable more RAD conversions, I should say. Keep in mind always that anything that has not been specifically waived by HUD, if it is a requirement for, they're saying this is like Section 8 new construction. There's a variety of types of programs under project-based Section 8. If any rule that has not been waived specifically that usually applies under Section 8 new construction does apply then once you've converted under RAD. That means anything found in 24 CFR Part 880, any relevant handbooks, notices, and other HUD guidance. Now, the use agreement must say that if the HAP is removed due to breach, noncompliance, or insufficiency of appropriations for all units covered under the HAP, new tenants must have incomes at or below 80% of the AMI, and tenants may not exceed 30% of 80% of the AMI for the appropriate unit size for the remainder of the term of the RAD use agreement. And it requires compliance with all fair housing and civil rights requirements, including marketing under an affirmative fair housing marketing plan. How are your initial contracts rent set? In the first section of the webinar, we discussed how initial contract rents will be set for projects being awarded conversions under the increase in the number of units that can convert of 40,000. HUD has calculated the new rents based on fiscal year 2016 funding levels. But we have to remember that in the PBRA world, initial contract rents will not exceed 120% of the FMR unless one is justified up to 150% of the AMR. And that can only happen if the PHA procures and submits a rent comparability study that justifies a rent being set above 120% of the FMR. There is no limit on the number of projects that PHA may bundle in the PBRA world, but again, the project that's lowering its rents, that's donating some funds, cannot convert later than the recipient one that's getting to raise their rents because of the rent bundling. When conversion will result in the reduction of one or more utility components used to establish the utility allowance, HUD will permit the RAD contract rent to be increased by a portion of the utility savings. The contract rent will be adjusted through, again, the application of the OCAF. The maximum rent is the higher of 140% of the FMR, or the market rents as demonstrated by a rent comparability study, again, procured and paid for by the project owner, be that a nonprofit or the PHA or a for-profit entity that's getting low-income housing tax credits. Where an RCS has been used to establish initial rents or to justify an OCAF adjusted rent that exceeds 140% of the AFR, that rent comparability study will remain valid for 5 years, and the maximum rent will not apply for the next 4 annual rent adjustments, and rents will be adjusted only by the OCAF. Regardless of project financing, there will be limitations on distributions to owners other than what is available as surplus cash as demonstrated by a HUD-approved audit. Under RAD, once all units under the HAP contract become occupied, then because you're in the PBRA world versus the PBV world, HUD will order a REACT inspection where they will use the UPCS standards to inspect your project. When it comes to residence rights, current households cannot be excluded, again, from returning at or living at the covered project based on any rescreening, income eligibility, or income targeting. Project owners must renew all leases upon lease expiration, including moving to work agencies. And again, the PHA or another owner must create a policy that they standardly implement, setting the length of the phase-in period for rent increases at 3 years or 5 years based on certain circumstances. Public housing residents that are currently FSS participants will continue to be eligible for FSS, and that PHA may continue to use any FSS funds already awarded to serve those particular participants who live in units covered by RAD. At the completion of the FSS grant, the PHA should follow their normal closeout procedures. And if you want to review all details in the notice on FSS provisions, you may well want to do so because FSS is new to the PBRA world. And so any of you who are here and you're going to be operating a project and you're already used to operating a project-based Section 8 projects, you're already working the PBRA world, you need to get a hold of how FSS is going to apply in your RAD converting projects. At the completion of the ROS SC grant, PHAs, again, should close it out following their normal procedures. And remember that your grantees may be nonprofits or local resident associations. You want to remember that all of your actions may affect them. And again, look to attachment 1B of the RAD notice for information on resident organizations. Written notice for termination of a lease, when that is applicable, shall be no longer than 30 days if the health and safety of the residents are threatened, 14 days for non-payment of rent, 30 days for other causes. Now, I know some of you may have other legal requirements you will need to meet when it comes to issuing tenant notices, especially in larger cities. The larger cities have a lot of requirements protecting tenants, including how long notices they need for different purposes. So you want to make sure that you meet those local requirements if they require longer term notices. Now, tenants receiving a PH or public housing earned income disregard at conversion will continue to receive it. And again, that's not usually part of the PBRA world. It applies only to residents receiving the earned income disregard at conversion, and to no tenants or existing tenants who are not on it at conversions. If they go off EID for any reason after conversions, they are not allowed back on it. Rent increases based on ending the EID are not subject to the 3 to 5 year phase-in. If tenants' TTP exceeds the gross rent, and so that means that the owner is not going to be receiving a half payment for that tenant, the tenant shall pay their TTP, which is not capped at the gross rent, less the utility allowance, or the maximum tax credit rent. Because again, since you're not getting a half payment for them, you cannot charge more than the tax credit rent. If a family is in under-occupied unit at the time of conversion, they remain in this unit until an appropriate sized unit becomes available, and then they are required to move to the unit that's the right size for them. They give multiple recommendations about maintaining the waiting list and ensuring the residents are placed on all other waiting lists, including site-based waiting lists. You must receive HUD approval for any refinancing or reconstructing or of secured debt during the contract term. And with respect to any financing contemplated at the time of conversion, that needs to be included in the RAD conversion commitment. Owners must submit year-end financial statements. This is generally required in the PBRA world. They're required by the Office of Housing. And you need to have a HUD-approved accountant who completes your audit as required for your particular kind of project and submit your financial statements on time. You may adopt a preference for single elderly persons subject to Chapter 4 of the 4350.3 handbook. Owners who wish to adopt a preference for populations that are not identified in that particular part of the CFR may do so pursuant to Housing Notice to 2013-21. So if you're looking to adopt additional preferences, get a hold of that housing notice. You want to make sure you thoroughly read Chapter 4 of the 4350.3 handbook. HUD has substantially expanded an owner's responsibility to communicate with their residents during the RAD application and conversion process. And so anyone involved in planning the management of conversion needs to review these requirements and ensure the process includes communicating with the residents as HUD now requires. All righty, let me see what time it is. Okay, Tracy, do you think we should go ahead and break for questions or continue on and finish the material?
We don't have any questions as of yet, so let's move forward with the remainder of the material, and we'll set time aside at the end.
Okay. Application requirements. All applicants must complete Microsoft Excel-based RAD applications on the RAD website, along with any other required materials. You want to keep your environmental impact statements in mind, and you want to begin assembling your environmental reports, any other reports during the application submission process. You want to think, what date do I want to get this application submitted by, and make sure you have all your materials and reports that are required, that you have all of those ready to go by that target date. You are encouraged to consider both 4% and 9% credits. They say that several times throughout the notice, and they really do mean it. Remember, again, that most states receive more than the demand exceeds their supply. The demand for the credits exceeds the supply they have to offer. If you want to apply for the big 9% credits, that is a very competitive process. You need to get a hold of your state's QAP, that's a qualified allocation plan, and that's where they score the applications they receive each year based on the criteria they've set for that specific year to see who are the winners and who are the losers for that year. Now, if you are submitting an application where you are proposing to use 9% credits, you either need to provide evidence that a reservation has already been secured, meaning you've already been awarded credits, or if that time hasn't come around yet in your state, a self-scored tax credit application where you self-score your project using the criteria set in the most recent qualified application plan. PHAs may submit applications involving multi-phase redevelopment of projects. The project being converted can be either one contiguous site or a single AMP. You need to note that for a single AMP, use of multi-phase authority provides more time for completion of all phases than use of the portfolio award. So you need to strategize about what's the best way to submit your applications for RAD conversions. If you've got multiple projects, what's the best way for you to do it for it to coincide with the timeline that you think you can meet? When we're submitting applications, all required materials, including attachments and narrative summaries, must be submitted electronically, we said, through the Microsoft Excel-based RAD application. In addition to submitting the RAD app as an Excel file, the executed attachments must be included as PDF files, and they receive absolutely no paper or fax submissions. Rejected applicants will be notified, and you may choose to resubmit to correct what they found faulty in your application and take another try at it. If you resubmit an application, it will be reviewed in order of the date of the resubmission. With regards to selection criteria, we are in what is referred to as the third application period. It began on 7/28/2015. For applications that meet all the eligibility criteria during the third application period, HUD uses priority categories to issue checks or determine their placement on the waiting list. The priority categories, in effect, at the time of the issuance of the check, apply in each instance. Now, while a waiting list has formed, a PHA can submit a letter of interest to reserve their place on the waiting list. PHAs must clearly indicate with their application submission if the project meets any of the priority categories and must provide information supporting their claim. Now, if you want to know if your project falls into one of what they call the high investment group, then you need to read what's on page 92 of the notice, because the categories are spelled out in detail. And how the waiting list works now, it just has two categories. Category 1, the top of the list, are those that qualify as a high investment project. And they tell you on page 92 how your project can qualify, the multiple ways your project can qualify as a high investment project. Underneath that comes everybody else, all other projects that do not meet the criteria for being a high investment project. So the top of the waiting list is always going to be the high investment projects. And so they're always going to get CHAP approval before the people at the bottom of the waiting list. When you submit only a letter of interest, like we talked about earlier today, you are automatically placed by date at the bottom of the waiting list. You can't be considered a high investment project and put at the top of the waiting list if you submit only a letter of interest. So if you think your project cannot qualify as a high investment project, there's no reason to not go ahead and just submit a letter of interest and get your place, your holding place on the waiting list. But if you believe your project will qualify as a high investment project and that will bump it to the top half of the waiting list, then you want to go ahead and submit that complete application as soon as you can so that you can be put in the top half of the waiting list, and it's by date. At the top of the waiting list is all of the high investment projects ordered by the date of application. So you want to keep that in mind when you're determining, am I going to submit a letter of interest, or should I go ahead now and submit a full RAD application? Choice mobility. This is something new in the PBRA world. For PBRA conversions, HUD will allow good cause exemptions on a first come, first served basis up to 10%. So that means for 10% of the units converting to PBRA, they will grant an exception and the project will not have to participate in choice mobility where a tenant can get a voucher to move. Again, that doesn't ordinarily apply in the PBRA world. But what can happen is if you submit for a PBRA conversion and HUD has already used their full 10% exception, you are in a holding pattern on the waiting list, because they will keep skipping over you on the waiting list until HUD has the ability to grant more exemption from choice mobility. And that's important because 10% is not that big of an exemption for HUD to be able to give out, given the size of a lot of these PBRA projects. So at any point, you may revise your application and certify that instead of waiting for HUD to be able to give you an exemption from choice mobility, you will agree to go ahead and meet the choice mobility requirements in place for the RAD program. Within 30 days of CHAP issuance, a PHA must confirm its acceptance of the CHAP by submitting an application, including all required attachments, into the inventory removals module in PIC, identifying the units that will be removed from the public housing annual contributions contract when the project completes conversion. The PHA is responsible for ensuring that upfront civil rights reviews and relocation activities are conducted as required by the RAD Fair Housing Civil Rights and Relocation Notice. HUD explains when an owner is responsible for submitting their financing plan based on when you receive your CHAP award. The dates vary based on the type of financing and if a project is to include low-income housing tax credits. A PHA will be notified of HUD's acceptance of your financing plan when they issue you a RAD conversion commitment, an RCC, conditioned upon firm commitment of the financing on substantially the same terms in your financing plan. The RCC sets the requirements of the transaction that will ultimately be included at closing, including the number of units being converted, the HAP contract rents, the choice of PBRA or PBB, financing terms and sources of uses, your development budget, and special conditions that must be cleared before closing. And whatever they put in the RCC, those terms survive closing. So you will be required to meet all of the terms spelled out in the RCC for your completion for your conversion to be truly complete. And when it comes to the closing, draft closing documents, including those listed in the RCC and any closing checklist provided by HUD, must be submitted to HUD for review prior to the closing. And you must use HUD forms. What they require for closing, those are the forms that you must submit. Closing may not occur until all policy and legal issues are addressed to HUD's satisfaction. And beginning on page 98 of the notice, HUD lists the steps an owner must take to leave the public housing program and enter either the PBB or PBRA program. Now, upon closing, the HAP contract will be effective on the first day of either of the 2 months following the closing at the owner's discretion. For the remainder of that first calendar year in which a HAP contract is effective, what we refer to as the year of conversion, operating funds and capital funds will be obligated to the PHA at the level of public housing subsidy, which that project is eligible to receive, regardless of what the initial rents are going to be. And HUD lays out in expanded detail how an owner can use their operating and capital funds during the year-end conversion. You want to take a look at that. For all repairs included in the scope of work in the RCC, project owners must submit to HUD a completion certification, not just a cost certification. It used to be a cost certification where you just had to submit and certify to the costs involved in the construction. Under what they're calling a completion certification, it includes that cost certification and other information about compliance with the requirements of the RCC. Now this jumps out. Any management fees earned following conversion are not subject to any federal limitations. Now we know in general in PBRA and project-based Section 8, management fees are regulated, spelled out in the Management Agent Handbook 4381.5. But they're saying here specifically for RAD projects that there will be no limit on management fees. Now notice 26 PIH 2016-3023 provides information and guidance regarding program activities that PHAs must complete regarding removal of their last public housing dwelling units from their public housing inventory. So that notice will tell you if you are really getting out of the public housing business and these are the last units you're converting, or for some reason these are the last units getting out of the public housing program, this notice tells you what you need to do. Now the release of the developer fee will be made on the schedule proposed by the PHA and accepted by HUD in the financing plan. They used to spell it out themselves, HUD did, but they decided that they will go with what is proposed in the financing plan. In tax credit transactions, the developer fee will be subject to the tax credit allocating agency limitations on developer fees. So when you're in the tax credit world, your tax credit agency will definitely place a limit on the amount of your developer fee, and also there will be a limit on the developer fee in the partnership agreement between the investors and the managing general partner. And also in the partnership agreement, it will spell out what milestones the general managing partner, the developer, needs to meet in order to receive each paid deposit of equity from the investor partners. So if you're using tax credits, you'll need to get used to all of that. Now, the undeferred portion of the developer fee, because sometimes the developer fee is deferred until you get into operations, and then project cash flow is used to fund the developer fee. The undeferred portion of the developer fee may not, without HUD approval, exceed the greater of 15% of the TDS total development costs, less acquisition payments made to the PHA developer fee and reserves, the lesser of $1 million or 15% of the TDC without offset for acquisition payments made to the PHA developer fee and reserves. All righty, that's everything. Before I turn to Tracy for any questions, I just want you to know I'm very happy to share this information with you. I know it was a lot of information, put out very fast, but we wanted to get it to you, and you have the PowerPoint presentation to read, and you also have access to the recording so you can listen to it again. If you want to reach me with any questions, you can do it through my website, LizBramlettConsulting.com, or my email is just liz@lizbramlettconsulting.com. I'll be happy to help you in any way that I can. So Tracy, where are we with questions?
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for all the information you covered today. There are a lot of significant changes with Revision 3, and you did a remarkable job of working through that information with only 9 minutes over our allotted time, so I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
We covered a lot of content and information, and want to take a few minutes now to see if anyone in our audience does have any questions. But while we wait for questions, I just want to remind our participants that the RAD Resource Desk contains a wealth of information and knowledge on RAD. It's available not only to PHAs and owners, but also to residents as well. If you're not already aware, the RAD Resource Desk has a public forum where anyone can search for information on RAD 1 or RAD 2 conversions. There are forms, notices, tools, checklists, a wait list of units is available there. And then there's also another more secured login section of the resource desk, where once logged in, individuals can search for firms or consultants, lenders, or say construction companies who are all experienced and familiar with all aspects of RAD components. So as Liz had indicated, searching out a firm who does CNAs and determining whether they are experienced with the requirements under RAD, if they're familiar with HUD's new CNA e-tool. These are all types of things that will help your transaction and your application go smoother and be processed a little bit quicker. There's also lenders who are available, syndicators, so you would want to be sure you select any lenders if you're taking on additional debt, that they're comfortable and familiar with RAD. That information is all available as Liz PowerPoint had suggested under www.hud.gov/RAD. And the RAD Resource Desk is continually being updated by HUD with information, notices, tools, forms. So I suggest that if you haven't already done so, take a few minutes to reach out and kind of research that website there. Also suggest if you're actively pursuing RAD or in the middle of any RAD conversions that you sign up for the RAD Blast through the RAD Resource Desk. And at this time, we don't have any questions, so I'm going to recommend that we conclude today's webinar. I certainly appreciate the time and attention that you took out of your day today to join us, and appreciate the information and presentation from Liz, as well as from Denise at NLHA. Feel free to check out our websites in the future, and stay tuned for our next series of RAD and other HUD updates in our webinars. Thanks, Liz. Everyone have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.